The disparities between what police departments are willing to do for white victims versus any victim who is a person of color runs deep. Oftentimes, the families of these victims are largely left on their own to do the majority of the legwork and to pass on what they find to investigators. This is a story that shouldn't exist in this day and age, and yet it still persists. This is the case of Sage Smith. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that you will find important information in the description box down below, including contact info and case IDs that are relevant to today's case. In addition to this, you will find a case suggestion link, links to other people's coverage of this case, and a pastebin link to my full list of sources, which I admit is pretty lengthy. There are also some links to some organizations and groups that are doing some really very important work in fighting against racism and discrimination against those in the LGBTQ+ community, as well as some good educational sources on these topics. These are things that I feel are very relevant to today's case, and I would highly suggest that if you have not looked at these and the work that these groups are doing, then you really should. More importantly, though, I needed to cover a couple of major things about today's case before we can adequately jump into the timeline of what happened. The first thing that I need to be perfectly clear about is that I will not tolerate any racism or transphobia or anything else of the sort in the comments of today's video or any other video. If I see anything that even comes close to this kind of behavior, it will be reported and removed. The second thing that I wanted to address is the way in which I will be referring to today's victim. I have noticed in my research, and I have seen that a lot of other people who have covered this case themselves have also noticed the same thing, that Sage Smith is often referred to by both her legal name and her chosen name, and she's also often referred to by both feminine and masculine pronouns. Now, I wanted to address this because I have given a lot of thought as to what way seems appropriate for me to refer to Sage as. Now, some friends of Sage's seem to believe that Sage was not transgender, but was instead a gay, cross-dressing man. Some of these friends so far seem to state that Sage was okay with presenting as female and going by she and her pronouns, even though she would also often present as male. Not long before her disappearance, Sage had changed her gender on her Facebook profile to female, and on November 9th of 2012, she had messaged a friend saying, "I am a girl now, #respected." Then on November 18th had messaged a family member saying, "Look, I am transitioning and I am your niece." However, I must also point out that many of Sage's family members have publicly said that Sage had not asked her family to refer to her as Sage or to use she/her pronouns, and many of these family members still refer to Sage by her legal name and with he/him pronouns. Now, in the later years of this case, during a press conference that we will talk about again later on in this video, the following was said by Detective Wright of the Charlottesville Police Department. After speaking with Sage's family and close friends, I understand Sage loved being a woman. Sage's grandmother, Miss Cookie, would be the first one to have a lot of pride and a lot of joy to tell you this. I also understand Sage was comfortable with being a man. Sage was comfortable with being called Sage, and Sage was comfortable with being called Dashad. Sage liked to dress as both a man and a woman. Miss Cookie once told me no matter whether Sage was dressed as a man or a woman, Sage just wanted to look good. Sage wanted to be fly, were her words. Family and friends have expressed Sage was still exploring gender identity at the time of the disappearance. That being said, Charlottesville Police Department will address Sage as Sage and will avoid the use of pronouns. We ask that you have patience with us because we are human and we will make mistakes. Because we are still looking for Sage's body and Sage had not begun to make a transition, there will be many times we will have to use the anatomically correct definition as a male. We will also ask that you respect Sage's family members and friends as they were each on their individual walks on their journey with Sage. And at the same press conference, Sage's mother had said that her son chose to be called whatever you felt comfortable with. With all of these statements in mind, I will personally be referring to Sage as Sage, not as Deshad, though you might hear that name on and off throughout the video as many of Sage's family members still refer to her as Deshad, which it seems was perfectly okay with Sage. Now, in addition to this, I will be using she, her pronouns, as it does seem that Sage was fully comfortable with using those pronouns and did in many situations choose to do so. But again, that was not the way in which many family members referred to Sage. And again, I want to point out that it seems from all of my research that Sage was truly okay with this. So with all of that out of the way, let us begin today's case. Sage Smith was born as Deshad Smith on December 13th, 1992. Now, for a lot of Sage's childhood, she was raised by her grandmother. However, at some point, she was given over again into the care of her mom. Though I didn't see anything specific as to when it happened, there was a point in time where Sage entered the foster care system. In 2011, she graduated from Charlottesville High School in Charlottesville, Virginia, and began taking cosmetology classes. Now, at this time, it seems that she also spent time working in a salon helping the stylist. She was able to secure an apartment with a couple of roommates through the assistance of the foster care system. One of these roommates happened to be a friend of Sage's named Shakira Washington. Now, Shakira and Sage had been friends for a few years at this point and grew up nearby each other. Their other roommate was Aubrey Carson. Now, both of these girls were also transgender. The walls in the apartment they got were painted a Barbie doll pink, and so they christened this the Dollhouse Mansion. Though Sage's sex at birth was male, Sage did seem to spend a lot of her teen years exploring her gender identity. She knew certainly at one point that she was gay, and eventually she started identifying as transgender to some of the people in her life. When it came to Sage's family, she seemed to be the most well-connected with her grandmother, who usually goes by the nickname of Cookie. Cookie was readily accepting of Sage when she originally came out and was the first person that Sage had told in her family. Though it wasn't an all-around welcoming experience to come out to her friends and family, it seems that over the years, those who didn't understand at first were able to come around to the idea that this was still just Sage, the same person they had always known before, just more comfortable now in identifying in the ways that felt right to her. Now, as I mentioned already, it was in the early days of November in 2012 when Sage had begun to make changes to her Facebook profile, indicating that she was possibly identifying more so as a woman, such as saying that she was a woman now and changing her gender on her profile to female. Now, a few days after these events, on November 20th, Sage had been planning to meet with someone for a date. Sage had supposedly mentioned this date to her roommate, Aubrey, and had said that she would be back that night. But by the time Sage was leaving the apartment around 6 p.m., Aubrey was napping. Though it wasn't clear in the first couple of days of the investigation just who Sage had been intending to meet, it would quickly be discovered that it was a man by the name of Eric McFadden. Now, they had planned to meet at the Amtrak station on West Main Street. Aubrey woke up to find that Sage wasn't home around 8 p.m. and she tried calling Sage to check in on her, but the call went straight to voicemail. This was the first sign that something wasn't quite right. Sage was well known for keeping her phone charged at all times, carrying a charger with her in case she needed to stop somewhere and charge her phone while she was out, and she never turned her phone off. Assuming Sage would return later though, Aubrey left it at that. It wasn't until the next day that yet again things didn't feel right. Sage still hadn't returned, and Aubrey decided to call Sage's grandmother. Now, Cookie hadn't seen Sage in that time, and she told Aubrey that if Sage didn't return by 10 p.m. to call the police and file a report. Unable to wait until 10, Aubrey called the police and submitted the first missing persons report for Sage at around 8 p.m. that night. At this point, Sage had been missing for 24 hours. 2 days later, Sage missed Thanksgiving dinner at her mother's house. This struck her family as very odd because on the same day that Sage had disappeared, she had spoken with her father for about a half hour and had mentioned how excited she was to celebrate Thanksgiving at her mother's home. Sage's phone was still either turned off or dead at this point, and no one could get a hold of her. Because of this, her family also reported her missing. Now, the next day, with Sage's family's help, officers were able to obtain Sage's phone records. These records revealed that the last call she had received had been at 6:36 on November 20th from an unidentified phone number. Now, police were later claiming that they wanted to find out who the number belonged to more quickly, so they gave the number to Sage's family. When none of them recognized the number, they posted it to Facebook with a plea for help in identifying who the number belonged to. Now, fairly quickly, they received a response, and this was when Sage's family and law enforcement discovered that this had been Eric McFadden that Sage had planned to meet for her date that night. Police were also able to determine that at some point Sage and McFadden had been speaking for a number of weeks through both phone calls and text messages. The messages seemed to reveal that the two had been having a sexual relationship and that McFadden was possibly paying Sage to keep it a secret from his girlfriend. One source states that possibly around this time is when Sage's father decided that the search for Sage wasn't going quickly enough, and so he decided to post McFadden's picture to Facebook, again asking for help in finding him so that the police could question him. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not precisely sure on whether or not this posting of McFadden's picture actually happened, and if it did, at what point in the investigation it happened. But the source that does mention this seems to include quotes from investigators that indicate that they felt that this move on Sage's father's part may have possibly influenced McFadden to flee the area, if he hadn't done so already. Now, I think it's important to mention that at this point in the investigation, there were a lot of ways in which Sage's family felt as though they were doing the largest part of the police's job. They had already been a part of obtaining phone records, it seems, and they were also organizing their own searches for Sage without police department assistance. They were also spending any moment that they could looking for clues and combing through Sage's social media for potential leads and passing all of that information on to investigators. Now, this was all in addition to being the ones who had been able to find out who the unidentified phone number belonged to, and they were even able to figure out where McFadden lived and worked and pass that on to police as well. One of the reasons that Sage's father felt the investigation was going too slowly was because the police weren't telling the family much of anything. According to statements from Charlottesville Police Lieutenant Ronnie Roberts, they had indeed done some interviews in the early days of the investigation, and they had decided that it would be inappropriate to tell the family any details about this, and this apparently included withholding whether or not McFadden had been found and questioned at all. On November 24th, the Charlottesville Police Department got a call from a woman trying to report Eric McFadden missing. Now, officers were able to determine that this woman was McFadden's girlfriend, and that Eric McFadden had been living with her on 14th Street in Charlottesville. According to the girlfriend, she had been away for Thanksgiving to celebrate with her family, and when she returned 2 days later, McFadden was nowhere to be found and she couldn't get a hold of him. Following this, law enforcement was also able to determine that McFadden had suddenly stopped showing up for work without letting any of his coworkers or his bosses know what he had been doing or why he was gone. Shortly after this, his girlfriend had spoken with police. McFadden called her and mentioned that he was in DC and that he needed money. She told him that he needed to speak to the police, and on November 27th, he called the station. He spoke briefly to investigators over over the phone and claimed that at this point he was actually in New York City. When asked why, he supposedly stated that he had never been before and wanted to go. When asked about Sage, McFadden said that she had never shown up that night to meet up with him at the Amtrak station and that he didn't have any idea what could have happened to her. According to the police, when they mentioned that McFadden should return to Virginia so that they could question him in person, he hung up on them. Then on November 29th, McFadden's girlfriend called the police station again, informing them that McFadden had emailed her and indicated that he would be coming back to Virginia on a bus and the police should pick him up from the bus station to question him. However, the next day, she called again to tell police that McFadden had suddenly changed his mind and wasn't coming back. Now, at this point, she also informed investigators that McFadden had emailed her and said that he actually had met up with Sage the night that she disappeared. He stated this in an email that was dated November 30th, which read, "I'm heading out. This is what happened. I never did anything sexual with that guy and he was blackmailing me. He wanted me to give him money, not to lie from saying we did, and I did, and he agreed to stop, and then the next time he hit me up for more money. I said no. We did meet up, but he had a lot of enemies. Me and him were walking and some people showed up and I kept walking, not looking back." It appears that this email was handed over to police by McFadden's girlfriend. However, when it came to getting search warrants for any further information, the police were greatly dragging their feet. Over and over again, the same sentiment was shared by the department, and this quote from Lieutenant Roberts seems to sum up what they believed was good reasoning to not pursue further information in many aspects of the case. It's not a criminal case. We have nothing at this point that indicates it being a criminal case, which makes it difficult to get warrants and things of that sort, because you have to have a criminal case to go in that direction. There's no evidence that points us in that direction right now. These kinds of excuses would be made again and again throughout this investigation. Now, with this publicly lackadaisical approach to the case, investigators still insisted that they were taking the case seriously and that they were working it very actively. So now that we've discussed the lengths that Sage's family went to in the early days of the investigation, let's discuss what police were doing. Now, according to the Charlottesville Police Sergeant Mark Brake, the morning after Aubrey Carson had called to report Sage missing, all available officers were instructed to conduct a grid search along the West Main Street corridor. It was mentioned that a witness statement had placed Sage heading west on this street between the Amtrak station and the ABC store. The statements mentioned that this grid search did include looking into trash bins and dumpsters in the area. Then Brake also says that he went out again the next day and conducted his own personal grid search for Sage in that same area. Now, at some point after Sage disappeared, though an exact date doesn't seem to be listed anywhere, police did a search of her apartment for any potential evidence. However, this doesn't seem to have been a very extensive examination of the apartment, and it seems that no forensic testing was performed. After the phone number had been identified as Eric McFadden's and Sage's family had found out where he lived, police expanded their search area to include this, which was 14th Street. On November 28th, officers conducted another search, and this time they included a wooden area that was situated near West Main Street and 14th Street Northwest. This is also when they made their first request for the use of cadaver dogs from the State Search and Rescue Coordinator. Because they hadn't made this request earlier, it wasn't until December 1st that they were actually able to conduct a search with the cadaver dogs. With a team of 6 dogs and their handlers, they conducted searches, which now also included the area from Ridge Street to Shamrock Avenue and another wooded area that was between Wurtland and Page Streets. Now, during this search, 2 of the dogs had given slight indications, meaning not very strong indications. suspicions that they may have picked up Sage's scent near a sediment pond situated behind a nearby UVA outpatient surgery center. Officers called in a dive team to search the pond, but ultimately nothing was found. In addition to these searches, between December 17th and 21st, a landfill search was conducted in relation to Sage's case at a landfill about 60 miles away from Charlottesville. So how exactly did law enforcement come to the conclusion that they needed to search this specific landfill? Well, interestingly enough, one of the sources I found on this case, titled The Hook, reported on this specific topic just a month after the searches were originally conducted. At first, people on the internet who were aware of this case were speculating that officers may have believed that Sage had taken one of the Amtrak trains and gotten off at a station closer to where this landfill is, and that after this is when something happened to her. But The Hook was able to break down the actual reasoning behind this course of action, and here is what they found. Now, The Hook did a survey of the dumpsters on the West Main corridor between Ridge Street and the Drury J. Brown Bridge, which is located by that Amtrak station. In total, there were 21 dumpsters, and there was a total of 5 companies that operated these dumpsters. Now, the trash that was picked up from the dumpsters would ultimately end up in different locations depending on which company operated which given dumpster. There were a few different landfills and recycling centers that The Hook was able to identify as locations for where the waste would end up. One of these locations was the Old Dominion landfill in Henrico, Virginia, which was about 60 miles from Charlottesville. However, the trash from only 5 of the total dumpsters along the West Main corridor would end up in this specific landfill because those 5 dumpsters were operated by Allied Waste, which is owned by Republic Services. Now, the Allied Waste trucks would pick up the trash from these 5 dumpsters, then take it to a transfer station, and from there, that waste would make its way to the Old Dominion landfill. After finding out this information, The Hook wondered why law enforcement would ultimately choose to focus on only this specific landfill when only 5 of the total 21 dumpsters on the West Main area eventually emptied into that landfill. Well, it turns out that, according to Sergeant Brake, their primary interest in dumpsters actually came from the area of 14th Street. Now, if you remember, this is the street that Sage's family were able to determine that Eric McFadden was living on. Police were able to determine that only one of the dumpsters in this area that they were interested in on 14th Street went to a landfill that wasn't Old Dominion. All of the other dumpsters on that street were operated by Allied Waste, and this supposedly included the dumpster that was used by the apartment complex where McFadden had been living with his girlfriend. Also, according to Sergeant Brake, law enforcement was pretty confident that McFadden did not have access to a vehicle at the time of Sage's disappearance. So if McFadden had something to do with what had happened to Sage, and it was a situation in which he needed to dispose of a body, it would have made sense that the dumpster was a prime choice because it was emptied 6 days a week. Now, this meant that the chance of a body being in the dumpster long enough for it to be discovered or noticed by someone was slim. This meant that the chance of a body being in the dumpster long enough for someone to notice was slim, and this method would also provide someone with a pretty quick way to get a body off of their hands. And this is how law enforcement had narrowed their search down to one single landfill that was 60 miles away from Charlottesville. The next thing that law enforcement needed to figure out, though, was what part of the landfill they needed to search, and to help them figure this out and to help them conduct the search in an effective manner, they actually enrolled the help of Ron Olive, who is a former Naval Criminal Investigative Service investigator, and is actually considered one of the leading experts on forensic landfill searches. Now, with this assistance, they were able to determine where they needed to search in the landfill. A large part of this was from utilizing Old Dominion records, which had been provided to investigators, along with the GPS of the truck which transported the waste from the transfer center to the landfill. This gave them an area of about 3,000 cubic yards to search. So on December 9th, the department flew Ron Olive into Charlottesville to physically help them with this search effort. Now, they had him spend the next 2 weeks training officers in the proper techniques and safety protocols for searching a landfill. So as I mentioned earlier, they didn't get around to doing any searching in the landfill until December 17th at the earliest, and ultimately, they didn't find any evidence of Sage. However, they supposedly found other things in this area of the landfill that told them that they had indeed been looking in the right spot. Now, law enforcement was also able to get the landfill to not place any more trash in this specific area, and they had planned on coming back to do further searches, which then took place in January. Again, there were no reports of anything substantive being found. Before we can begin to move on to any other details about Sage's case, it's very important that we discuss the criticisms that the investigation has received. The reason I think that we need to discuss these criticisms here as opposed to later in the video is because a large part of the investigation was centered around Eric McFadden, and a big part of the criticism is that police not only did too little in trying to interview him to find out what he may have known, but that they also spent too much time focusing on only him and no one else as a potential person of interest. So early on in the investigation, Kenneth Jackson, a cousin of Sage's, had expressed how he felt about the city's efforts of finding Sage by stating, "The police department has not done what it's supposed to do to find our child, and we don't want special treatment, just equal treatment." He also added that it was his belief that the FBI and that state resources should have been utilized in the search for Sage very early on in the case. In addition to this, Kenneth suggested that the department should open up to meeting potential witnesses outside of an interrogation room, stating there are people who may know things who aren't willing to go to the police station. Then, about 20 days after Sage's disappearance, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation was highlighting the fact that Sage's case hadn't been taken up by local media to help it get the attention it needed to help the community find Sage. According to an article from the Huffington Post, Sage's family and friends had to organize their own search parties to continue to try to find Sage without the help of law enforcement. Now, in addition to this, only one local news source had really covered that story early on. Now, Kenneth Jackson had also compared the response to Sage's case to that of Morgan Harrington's. In 2009, Morgan Harrington was attending a Metallica concert in Charlottesville. During the opening act, she left the arena to use the restroom, but wasn't allowed back in due to a very strict no re-entry policy. Following this, she went missing. Kenneth talks about how in Morgan's case, the state police had become involved in searching for her within 24 hours of her disappearance, and how searches were organized and carried out with bloodhounds and helicopters. Morgan's case had quickly gained national attention, and there was a large amount of support from authorities on many levels to find her. However, for Sage, there was virtually nothing. From some of Sage's family, they felt that the police had both botched the investigation into McFadden by not being able to locate him early on and conduct a full interview, and by focusing too heavily on McFadden. There were concerns amongst some who knew Sage that her friends could have been involved or may have known more than they were letting on. Now, Sage's father, Dean, had spoken specifically on the ways in which at least one of her roommates had been acting after Sage disappeared. According to quotes from Dean that were in a Crimola article, he stopped at Sage's apartment the day after she had disappeared and noticed that all of her wigs were gone. The article states that Dean believed that Sage's roommate Ashley Carson had taken them. Eventually, it was revealed that CCTV footage also showed Carson using Sage's EBT card at a gas station. Now, many people have wondered why would one of Sage's roommates use her food stamp card? Well, it seems that Aubrey may have made claims as to the card being communally shared among the three roommates, implying that this was the kind of thing that was normal for them and that they simply pooled their resources for the benefit of all of them. In addition to these things, there was another friend of Sage's that was supposedly seen wearing one of her lockets after she had disappeared, claiming that the locket was given to them by a boyfriend and wasn't the same one that Sage had owned. Now, reporters in the years since Sage went missing have been able to determine that while Charlottesville police were claiming to be working hard on Sage's case, they were at the very least not following proper protocols. In the event of a missing persons case, there are apparently certain things that are supposed to be done, such as requesting support from search and rescue in the early hours of an investigation. It's also protocol for officers to make requests for a delay in trash pickup in the area where an abduction may have occurred. In addition to these, officers should make appropriate requests for search warrants for things like emails and online communications. Now, it turns out that Charlottesville police never made any request to delay trash pickup in the area where they were searching for Sage. While the other protocols were followed, it was definitely at a much slower pace than they should have worked at. It wasn't until December 1st, a full 11 days after Sage had disappeared, that any external support was used when it came to searching for her. And as for those warrants for online communications are concerned, there weren't any requests made until March 11th, which was just under 4 months after Sage had disappeared. Again, officers had previously stated that this was because Sage's case wasn't classified as a criminal investigation, but they never seemed to give a good reason as to why police refused to classify it as such in order to fully investigate it. Now, police also seem to have dropped the ball when it came to interviewing people other than McFadden as well. Aubrey Carson wasn't even contacted by police until 3 or 4 days after Sage went missing, even though Aubrey had been the first person to call and report Sage as missing at the request of Sage's grandmother. She was also the last person to have seen Sage at their apartment that day, but police delayed contacting her for some unknown reason. When police finally did arrange an interview with Aubrey, she had requested to be picked up to be brought to the station because she didn't have a car. Now, an officer was supposed to pick her up at her grandmother's house, but no one ever showed up. Because of this, it wasn't until another 2 weeks had passed that she was finally interviewed. Then there was another man that police would end up questioning, which we will come back to in a minute here, who also ran off and never contacted police again. So what was law enforcement's reasoning for not having taken any of these necessary steps earlier on? It seems that the Charlottesville Police Department largely relied on a line of, this is not currently a criminal investigation and we don't have any evidence to suggest that it is a criminal case, to explain away why they hadn't been able to obtain search warrants in a timely manner and why they weren't requesting external support for these search efforts right away. But even other members of the department in the years to come would reflect on these kinds of statements and say that they didn't know why anyone with the department would have said such a thing. And one officer in particular even said that he didn't understand why he himself had said the same thing at one point. So it's obvious to all involved now that there was no true reasoning behind the statements of this case not being a criminal investigation, and yet these statements were repeated time and time again. On December 1st, an NBC article stated that the police did not suspect foul play. On December 7th, an officer told Sage's family that the city wouldn't be seeking help from the state police or the FBI unless it was really necessary, which at that time, they didn't believe it was. And even in December of 2014, which let us not forget was 2 full years after Sage had disappeared, the Crimola article states that an officer was still saying that Sage was just a missing persons case and not a criminal case. It seemed to be clear to many of Sage's friends and family members that her case wasn't getting the same attention as similar cases involving white women. Not only were there comparisons to the case of Morgan Harrington, but in 2014, a new case would draw further comparisons to the disparities in these cases. It was September 13th of 2014 that Hannah Graham, who was an 18-year-old student at the University of Virginia, went missing from Charlottesville. It took less than 24 hours for her case to be passed on to the Virginia State Police, and within just days, multiple police departments in the state of Virginia and even the FBI, along with multiple search and rescue groups, were involved in the search for Hannah and the investigation into her disappearance. In addition to this, the city of Charlottesville itself contributed $10,000 to a total $50,000 reward being offered for information in Hannah's case. The Charlottesville Police Department held multiple and frequent press conferences about Hannah's disappearance, and the case was almost immediately picked up by news outlets nationwide. Just like in Sage's case, there was a main person of interest early on. This man's name was Jesse Matthew Jr., and just like Eric McFadden, he had left the state soon after Hannah disappeared. But unlike in Sage's case, though, when Jesse Matthew Jr. fled, there was a nationwide manhunt for him, and he was found and arrested after only 36 days. Now, in the end, this man pled guilty not only to the murder of Hannah Graham, but also the 2009 abduction and murder of Morgan Harrington. So all in all, many have been left to wonder what would have happened in Sage's case if she had been treated the same way that these white women were. But in the end, it wasn't just the failings of the Charlottesville Police Department that hindered this investigation. It was also the failings of local media and the failings of media elsewhere in the country who didn't value Sage's story as much as they valued the story of missing white women. Now, one of the reasons that cases like Hannah's and Morgan's are oftentimes more thoroughly investigated is because the media shines a spotlight on them. With everyone looking at a police department to solve a particular case, there is a lot of pressure to continue working on it until progress is made and hopefully, eventually, a suspect is apprehended, charged, and ultimately convicted. But is this where the failings end? Of course not. Some of the biggest failings of all lie on the people as a whole of this country, and honestly, in a number of other countries as well. It is a well-known fact, and one that I have pointed out in multiple videos now, that society as a whole is more likely to put their time and effort into caring about a case, about a victim who is either a girl, is young, is white, or is a combination of these things. So does it surprise me that a case like Sage's didn't get the attention that it very much deserved? No. It doesn't surprise me at all, but it does truly break my heart, and it makes me all the more passionate about sharing cases like this, like Sage's. Now, I have seen a lot of excuses made by the Charlottesville Police Department, like this following quote from the Crimola article that states, "The frustrating part is that instead of helping us find Sage, people want to argue about gender issues and things like that. I don't think it should matter." Well, let me tell you, here and now, it 100% matters, because it is exactly those kinds of issues that prevented the proper work from being done in the first place. It wasn't the fact that the issues simply existed and that people wanted to talk about them and point them out that prevented officers from doing more. It was the fact that the officers didn't do more because of their lack of interest in solving cases that involve these issues. Plain and simple. It is extremely important that we as a society acknowledge that these issues still exist and still cause a lot of pain for people who just want to find their missing loved ones and who just want to see proper justice served. But now that we've covered the criticisms of the investigation, I want us to jump back into the facts surrounding this case, because while law enforcement focused a lot on Eric McFadden, there were a number of other things that have been extremely relevant to Sage's disappearance that we need to discuss. So what exactly weren't the police focusing on as possible leads in Sage's case? As I discussed a couple of minutes ago, there was some suspicious behavior from Sage's roommate and from some of her friends after her disappearance, which didn't sit right with a lot of Sage's family. It seems odd that someone would use a friend's food stamps after they've disappeared, or that they would take or wear that missing person's wigs. Then for a friend to have taken and worn one of Sage's lockets after she disappeared, it felt like another slap to the face. It didn't seem respectful to Sage at all, but was it possible that the girls living together in the apartment had actually pooled their resources together and that it was indeed normal for them to share something like an EBT card, it may be possible, and perhaps they truly were that close, but it still doesn't seem right to most people. Then there was the fight that didn't seem to have been investigated by officers hardly at all. Now, on November 19th, the girls were celebrating Shakira's 19th birthday. During this party at their apartment, another girl showed up wanting to fight one of Sage's friends. Supposedly, the fight was about a man. The confrontation ended up moving outside, where Sage and her roommates discovered that cars lined the street outside their apartment, and as they stepped out, car doors were suddenly opening and a brawl seemed to ensue. As the fight became physical, Sage somehow ended up fighting with a man named Jamel Smith, and the police were called by someone that night, and the fighting was ultimately broken up. Now, Jamel filed a report against Sage claiming that she had caused damage to his car, but there were no arrests. Now, according to Shakira, it wasn't uncommon for fights to happen, but it did seem strange to her that the fight somehow ended up centering around Sage because it hadn't started with her. Now, after the fight, Shakira was upset and she decided to leave with other friends for her hometown instead of staying at the apartment. Now, according to Lieutenant Mooney, via the Crimola article I found, Jamel had been interviewed at some point after Sage's disappearance and didn't seem to have an alibi for that night. And then shortly after questioning, he moved away and had been out of contact since then. Beside this effort, there doesn't seem to be much public mention of this fight or the ways in which it could have possibly related to Sage's disappearance. Again, this fight took place on November 19th of 2012, the night immediately before Sage's disappearance. It doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility that someone may have been holding a grudge from the fight or from whatever had caused the fight in the first place. Now, perhaps they had decided to take this out on Sage for some reason. In addition to this, the man that Sage fought with seemed to post some derogatory things toward her on social media the night following the fight. Now, in November of 2015, Charlottesville Police held a press conference announcing that Eric McFadden was not a person of interest. It seems that some of the reasonings they gave for making this decision were that McFadden didn't have a car for transporting Sage's body or a viable way other than that to discard of a body, and he had stayed in town for at least 2 days after Sage disappeared. Now, officers knew that he had stayed in town for at least 2 days based on a CVS receipt they had found in his apartment in the early days of the investigation and CCTV footage that they reviewed, which showed that he had been in the CVS at the time of the purchase on the receipt. Now, another point of contention was that officers had determined that according to text messages between Sage and McFadden, they believed that he had never met up with Sage that night. Using the phone records and other witness statements, a timeline was built for Sage's night on November 20th. At 5:17, there was a text from Sage to McFadden saying, "When are you leaving?" Then at 5:20, McFadden replied, "I already did, I'm at the Hampton Inn." Then between 5:17 and 5:40, Sage and McFadden exchanged a series of texts, the contents of which have not been publicly released. At about 5:40, Sage left her apartment to meet McFadden at the Amtrak station. Then at 6:08, there was a text from McFadden to Sage saying, "Where are you at?" He then sent another text at 6:12 which read, "I'm standing here, where are you?" Between 6:18 and 6:37, phone records indicate that Sage was on a call with a friend from Northern Virginia. Now, during this call, McFadden was still texting Sage. At 6:27, still during Sage's phone call, McFadden sent his last text to Sage saying, "Bye, you stood me up," shaking my head. At 6:35, Sage spoke to a witness at a bus stop in the 400 block of West Main Street. According to the witness, Sage said that she was meeting someone at the Amtrak station. Then at 6:40, Sage was reportedly headed westbound on West Main Street. Finally, at 7 that night, some reports placed Sage at the Wild Wing Cafe by herself. This cafe was situated by the Amtrak station. Now, though there were various CCTV cameras in the area where Sage had been, there were no recordings being made at the time. Something important that I want to touch on about this timeline, though, and about investigators ruling out McFadden based on it is that he had indeed denied having met up with Sage that night. The messages that were recovered from Sage's phone records seem to support this claim, but we also know that McFadden had emailed his girlfriend and admitted to actually having met up with Sage. So why would the text messages seem to indicate that he hadn't met up with Sage, even though he had admitted doing so? Is it possible that these messages reflect that Sage and McFadden didn't meet up quite at the time that they had planned, but maybe had run into each other sometime after the original meeting time? It's possible, but without further information or evidence, we have no way of knowing for sure. However, we do know that reports in the early days of the investigation said that Sage's last phone call actually came in at 6:36. This doesn't seem to fit in with the timeline that law enforcement provided in 2015. According to the new timeline, Sage was on a phone call with a friend from Northern Virginia between 6:18 and 6:37, and McFadden's last contact with Sage had been his text message at 6:27. But officers had originally found out about McFadden based on him being the last person to call Sage the night she disappeared. So I don't really understand how we are supposed to reconcile these two different stories that seem to both be coming from the police department. Now, Sage's case was reclassified from a missing person case to a homicide sometime between December of 2016 and March of 2017 by the Charlottesville Police. Different sources give different times at which this announcement was actually made, but sometime between the end of 2016 and early 2017, the reclassification took place. Sage's case was also handed over to a new detective, Regina Wright. Sources seem to indicate that this new detective was taking a serious and brand new look at the case and wasn't just utilizing the work done by previous detectives. Instead, it seemed that this new detective was re-interviewing witnesses and re-investigating previous leads in the case. Now, even though the case was getting a fresh look over, Sage's grandmother was still being told that the FBI would only be contacted to assist in Sage's case if and when they were needed. About a year and a half after this, in May of 2018, investigators conducted another search as well as performed forensic testing in the apartment that Sage had lived in at the time of her disappearance. The detective working Sage's case stated, "Sometimes, even when you go back after many years, you can still find traces of DNA evidence. Blood that was wiped away can still be found after several years." It was revealed that this forensic testing performed during this search was the first time that a full forensic unit had investigated the apartment. It wouldn't be until another year later that more updates would come in. On June 26 of 2019, the Charlottesville Police, along with members of Sage's family, held a press conference. Captain James Mooney told the media that law enforcement had indeed spoken with McFadden shortly after Sage's disappearance, and then he failed to show up for an in-person interview. They also mentioned that neither police nor certain members of McFadden's family have seen or heard from him since, and an email sent to his girlfriend in May of 2013 was the last known communication. After speaking to McFadden's mother a couple of weeks prior to the press conference, they had opted to file a missing persons report for Eric McFadden. Detective Wright read out a statement from Sage's father discussing that he felt there hadn't been equality in the treatment of Sage's case because his child was Black and transgender, but that the mission now was just to do what they could to bring Sage home. Detective Wright then read a statement from McFadden's mother, which said that his mother hadn't known her son was missing until 2014. She also mentioned that she had believed that his father had filed a missing persons report, and though she has made attempts to contact her son's father, he hasn't made any attempts to return that contact. Now, the statement then tells McFadden that if he's out there and needs help, he can call his mother. His mother's statement says, "Let's bring an end to this so everyone involved can begin to heal." In this same press conference, Sage's mother spoke about needing closure and not being able to grieve properly because she doesn't know where Sage is or what happened to her. Along with this, Sage's sister spoke about having grown older than Sage ever had and the things that Sage had missed out on. She then went on to discuss that Eric McFadden or anyone else who knows anything about what happened to Sage needs to come forward and let the family and law enforcement know what they've been keeping secret all these years. Following this, Captain Mooney spoke about possible locations that McFadden may have traveled through or have been living in since his disappearance. This list included Baltimore, Maryland, Joppa, Maryland, Lake City, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, New York, Rochester, New York, and possibly other unknown locations out on the West Coast. An update on the case came in November of 2020 when investigators stated that, actually, at this time, we are exploring new active leads in this case. I can't share specifics on what those are due to the sensitivity of the case, but we are pursuing those actively with the assistance of local, state, and federal partners. And that is essentially where Sage's case stands today. So when it comes to Sage's case, we can't know for sure if Eric McFadden actually had anything to do with her disappearance, though I'm sure many of us can agree on the fact that it doesn't look good from what we do know about the case. Many people still wonder if perhaps McFadden had fled because his secret was out. Being outed as gay can be very traumatizing. There are many people who wonder if McFadden wasn't involved, if maybe he felt he just could no longer be near his family and friends now that they would know that he was having sex with a man. It's unfortunate that anyone should have to harbor worries like that, but it does happen. So perhaps for McFadden, this was simply enough to make him want to leave, or perhaps he had witnessed something that had happened to Sage and was too scared to come back, fearing that maybe something would happen to him as well. We may never know for sure what involvement Eric McFadden did or did not have. Either way, he is still considered a missing person and someone who law enforcement would like to speak with. Eric McFadden is a black man with black hair and brown eyes who stands at 5'10" and may weigh anywhere between 150 pounds and 190 pounds according to various sources. Sage Smith, on the other hand, has not been seen since the night of November 20th, 2012. Her family deserves answers and closure. Sage was a black transgender woman who stood at 5 feet 8 inches and weighed about 130 pounds. She often had long hair worn in braids and often wore women's clothing and wigs. Her ears and her left eyebrow were pierced, and at the time of her disappearance, Sage was wearing a black jacket, dark gray sweatpants, a black scarf, and black rain boots with pink and purple lining, possibly a bleached hooded sweatshirt. Sage goes by Sage or her legal name of Deshad and was known to present as female or male at different times and to use either he, him, or she, her pronouns. A $10,000 reward is being offered through Crime Stoppers, along with an additional $10,000 that is being matched by the city of Charlottesville from an anonymous donation they received about a month after Sage had disappeared. This reward money is available for information that leads to an arrest in Sage's case. If you have any information in Sage's case, I would urge you to contact the Charlottesville Police Department. You can contact them at 434-970-3970. You can also contact the Q Center for Missing Persons at 910-343-1131. Or you can call into their 24-hour tip line. You can do that at 910-232-1687. All information submitted to Crime Stoppers or the CUE Center for Missing Persons is kept confidential. So what are your thoughts on today's case? This one took a lot of willpower to complete the research on because I just kept becoming so frustrated with the ways in which Sage's case wasn't treated as well as other cases. I'm absolutely sure that racism and transphobia likely played a role in that, and I wouldn't be surprised if her disappearance was related to a hate crime that was carried out against her for either of these prejudices. What I am glad about when it comes to this case is that there has been a lot of coverage multiple times by many different creators over the years. I feel that the true crime community has a lot of power to get cases like this that deserve more attention back out there in the public eye. It's the whole point really of doing any of this. Getting more eyes on a case will only help to put more pressure on the department to properly work it and try to resolve it. In addition to all of that, I am truly hoping the best for Sage's family. I honestly can't imagine what it must be like not only to lose a loved one, but to not have her case treated well like this. to not get the media attention that the family member deserves, or the support of the community or the society in general. I'm truly hoping the best for them, and I hope that one day Sage's case will be solved and that justice will be served. Let me know what your thoughts are about today's case, though, in the comments down below. Just remember, as always, to remain respectful. You can also help me to continue putting these cases back in the public eye by sharing this video or someone else's, or by even liking, commenting, or subscribing. Even just watching videos like these helps to keep victims' stories in people's minds. So thank you so much for watching today's video, and I will see you all again soon for another case.